The day someone tells you your own land belongs to everyone else is the day you find out how much the truth is really worth. The sharp metallic clang of an excavator bucket echoed across my front yard before the sun had fully cleared the old oak trees. I could smell fresh diesel hanging in the cool morning air, mixing with damp grass and the earthy scent that had greeted my family every spring for generations. My boots crunched over loose gravel as I stepped onto the porch, still holding a mug of black coffee that suddenly tasted colder than it had a second earlier. 50 feet away, a bright green sign leaned against the bucket of the excavator, waiting to be planted like a flag of conquest. Community Green Space. Future Park Expansion. Approved by Willow Creek Estates HOA. Standing beside it was Margaret Holloway, the HOA President, dressed in an immaculate white blazer that somehow stayed spotless despite the construction dust swirling around her. She held a clipboard against her chest with the confidence of someone who had never once expected to hear the word no. Around her stood nearly 20 neighbors, some curious, some excited, all convinced they were about to witness another neighborhood improvement project. Margaret smiled the moment she saw me. It wasn't the kind of smile that welcomed a conversation. It was the smile of someone announcing a decision that she believed had already become permanent. "Good morning, Ethan," she called. "I hope this won't inconvenience you too much." The board voted unanimously. This property now serves the community. I looked from her face to the excavator, then farther down the property line where a worker had already tied fluorescent orange ribbon around a weathered iron survey stake sticking just a few inches above the soil. Most people would have mistaken it for an old piece of scrap metal. I knew exactly what it was. My grandfather had shown it to me when I was 9 years old. I could still hear his gravelly voice over the sound of cicadas as he rested one rough hand on my shoulder. "Son, people can argue over fences, paperwork, even memories. But they can't argue with a monument that's been sitting in the same ground longer than any of us have been alive." Back then I hadn't understood why that rusty piece of iron mattered. Standing there decades later, watching a construction worker prepare to pull it out with a chain, I finally did. Margaret continued speaking as if delivering a speech she'd rehearsed for weeks. "According to the latest subdivision survey," she explained, "the strip of land between my driveway and the creek had always been intended as shared community space." She spoke about improving property values, creating walking paths, giving families a place to gather. Every sentence sounded polished enough to belong in a real estate brochure. A few neighbors nodded in agreement. Someone even clapped quietly. No one looked at me. No one asked whether the land had belonged to my family since long before the subdivision ever existed. They had already accepted the version of history printed on glossy HOA documents. I took one slow sip of my coffee and tasted nothing. My eyes never left that old survey monument. It sat there quietly beneath decades of dirt, ignored by everyone except me. Margaret thought the battle was already over because she had newer maps, newer paperwork, and louder voices standing beside her. What she didn't know was that somewhere inside my grandfather's garage rested a faded survey map that had survived floods, storms, 3 county record updates, and nearly a century of changing property lines. Before this day was over, that forgotten piece of paper was going to destroy everything she believed she owned. Ever since I could remember, that stretch of land had never been measured by money. It had always been measured by memories. I stood there watching strangers prepare to erase a boundary that my family had spent almost a century protecting, and for a moment I was not 46 years old anymore. I was 9 again, chasing dragonflies along the creek while my grandfather, Harold Walker, carried a worn leather survey bag over one shoulder. He was never a famous man. He never ran for office or built a company with his name on the side of a skyscraper. He was simply the county surveyor who believed that honest measurements kept honest neighbors. He used to tell me that property lines were not created by arguments. They were discovered through patience, records, and respect for the people who came before us. Every Saturday morning he would walk this land with an old brass compass, a field notebook that smelled faintly of aged paper and cedar, and a shovel worn smooth by decades of careful work. While other kids learned baseball statistics, I learned how to recognize original survey monuments, witness trees, and section corners. He would stop beside an old iron pin almost hidden beneath wild grass and brush the dirt away with nothing more than his work glove. Then he would smile like he had just shaken hands with an old friend. He always said the land remembered everything, even when people forgot. After college, I followed his footsteps and became a licensed professional land surveyor myself. I spent more than 20 years settling boundary disputes across 3 counties. Farmers, developers, families dividing inherited property, even state agencies called when survey records became complicated. I had testified in court, reconstructed missing property corners, and traced deeds that reached back more than 100 years. I knew exactly how easily modern maps could hide old mistakes when someone stopped looking for the original evidence. That was why I never worried much about our family property. The records were complete. The monuments were intact. The deed had passed from my grandfather to my father and finally to me without a single dispute. At least, that was what I believed. My house sat quietly beside Willow Creek on just under 18 acres, surrounded by towering oak trees that filled every autumn afternoon with the smell of dry leaves and fresh earth. The old red barn still leaned slightly to the west after 70 years, and every spring the creek carried enough water to reflect the sunrise like polished glass. Most evenings I would finish work, pour a cup of coffee, and sit on the porch listening to tree frogs replace the distant traffic as daylight disappeared. It was the kind of peace people spent their entire lives searching for. Then the subdivision arrived. One neighborhood became 2, then 3. New streets replaced open pasture. Decorative stone entrances appeared where cattle gates once stood. Families moved in who had never seen the land before sidewalks covered it. I welcomed every new neighbor who introduced themselves because I believed good communities were built by people, not paperwork. Margaret Holloway had moved into Willow Creek Estates only 4 years earlier. By the second year, she was leading committees. By the third, she had become president of the Homeowners Association. By the fourth, she spoke about the neighborhood as though she had personally invented every road, every lot, and every rule. Looking at her standing on my property that morning, surrounded by polished documents and confident smiles, I realized something my grandfather had warned me about decades earlier. Sometimes the most dangerous people are not the ones trying to steal your land in secret. They are the ones convinced they already own it because no one has challenged them yet. Margaret never raised her voice because she never believed she had to. Authority, at least in her mind, was something you wore like an expensive blazer. Every Tuesday evening she stood at the front of the Willow Creek Estates clubhouse with neatly organized binders, colorful presentation slides, and a smile polished by years in real estate. She knew exactly how to make ordinary people believe they were voting for progress instead of surrendering common sense. She talked about increasing property values, creating beautiful gathering spaces, preserving community character, and protecting neighborhood investments. Every sentence sounded reasonable until you looked closely enough to notice whose property always seemed to become everyone else's responsibility. During the first year after she became president, she convinced residents to approve decorative entrance monuments that cost twice the original estimate. The next year it was expanded walking trails, then upgraded landscaping, then a proposal for a larger community park. Every project seemed to grow a little farther beyond the subdivision map than the last. Most homeowners never questioned it because the changes made the neighborhood look nicer. They saw fresh flowers instead of survey lines. They admired brick pathways instead of property corners. Margaret understood something that many people never realize. If you repeat a story often enough with enough confidence, eventually people stop asking whether it is true. She began mentioning my property at board meetings without ever saying my name directly. She called it an underused green corridor. She described it as an ideal location for future recreation. She displayed enlarged maps on a projector, tracing colorful lines across the screen with a silver pointer while explaining that historical inconsistencies had finally been corrected through updated subdivision surveys. Sitting quietly in the back of one meeting, I watched neighbors nod as if they were witnessing an objective scientific presentation instead of a carefully constructed sales pitch. Nobody in that room knew that the map on her screen had been created decades after the original property boundaries were established. Nobody asked why certain older survey monuments were missing from the drawing. They simply trusted the newest document because it looked official. A month later, I received a professionally printed letter on heavy cream-colored paper carrying the association seal across the top. It thanked me for my anticipated cooperation during the upcoming park expansion and informed me that temporary construction activity would occur along what it described as community property adjacent to my residence. Not once did the letter ask permission. It assumed agreement before the conversation had even begun. I drove to the clubhouse the following afternoon carrying copies of my deed, expecting nothing more dramatic than a simple misunderstanding. Margaret welcomed me into her office with fresh coffee already waiting on the table. The room smelled faintly of vanilla candles and new carpet. Framed neighborhood awards covered one wall beside carefully staged photographs of smiling families enjoying community events. She barely glanced at my paperwork before sliding a laminated subdivision map toward me. With one perfectly manicured finger, she tapped a bright green section, running along my creek. "These are the current records recognized by the association," she said calmly. "Sometimes older deeds contain descriptions that have since been clarified." Clarified. She spoke the word as though nearly 100 years of recorded ownership could disappear because a newer piece of paper used brighter ink. I folded my documents without arguing. Experience had taught me that people who rely on appearances rarely listen to facts during the first conversation. As I walked back outside, a cool breeze carried the smell of freshly cut grass across the parking lot. Children laughed somewhere behind the clubhouse while maintenance crews planted flowers beside the entrance sign. Everything looked peaceful. Everything looked perfectly organized. And that was exactly what made the situation so dangerous. Because by the time I realized Margaret was not making an honest mistake, she had already convinced an entire neighborhood that the line my grandfather had protected for decades had never existed at all. The first orange construction fence appeared 3 days later. I heard the steady backup alarm of a skid steer before I ever saw it. The sharp electronic beeping bouncing off the trees that had stood along the creek since my grandfather was a young man. By the time I walked outside, workers were unloading stacks of lumber, bundles of landscape fabric, and pallets of decorative stone. Nobody knocked on my door. Nobody asked for permission. They moved with the quiet confidence of people who believed every signature had already been collected somewhere else. One crew stretched bright string between temporary stakes, while another spray painted arrows across the grass only a few feet from the old survey monument that still sat unnoticed beneath weeds and fallen leaves. The smell of fresh paint drifted through the morning air, mixing with damp soil and the sweet scent of blooming wildflowers that would soon disappear beneath gravel. I approached the foreman and introduced myself. He was polite enough. He checked his work order twice before looking back at me with an uncomfortable expression. According to the documents he had received, everything from the creek bank to the planned walking trail belonged to the community easement authorized by the Homeowners Association. He even apologized before returning to work. He was simply following the paperwork placed in front of him. By that afternoon, the first complaint arrived in my mailbox. It claimed my split-rail fence had been installed inside common property and demanded that I remove the remaining sections within 10 business days to avoid additional penalties. 2 days later, another notice informed me that my storage shed partially obstructed future recreational improvements. Then came a letter warning that unauthorized landscaping within association property could result in daily fines. Every envelope carried official logos, reference numbers, and carefully written legal language. Reading them felt like watching someone slowly rewrite the history of my own front yard one paragraph at a time. The neighbors changed almost overnight. People who had waved every morning suddenly avoided eye contact. A few offered sympathetic smiles, but kept walking. Others began treating the grass beside my driveway as though it already belonged to the neighborhood. Parents let their children wander across it while discussing where the future picnic tables might go. One evening, I found colorful survey flags planted only a few feet from my porch, fluttering gently in the breeze like tiny reminders that somebody else had already drawn new lines across my life. At the next board meeting, Margaret presented artist renderings of the finished park. Families gathered around large display boards admiring shaded benches, flower gardens, and a winding trail beside Willow Creek. Applause filled the room after every slide. Then she thanked the community for supporting what she called a long overdue restoration of shared land. I remained silent. Correcting her in front of everyone would not have changed a single mind, because she had already given them something far more powerful than facts. She had given them a beautiful story. As the meeting ended, several residents congratulated her on improving the neighborhood. One man even shook her hand, and called her a visionary. I walked back to my truck beneath a sky turning deep orange with the setting sun, listening to gravel crunch beneath my boots. For the first time in my career as a surveyor, I understood what it felt like to become invisible inside your own boundary line. They had not taken my land with force. They were taking it with assumptions, polished documents, and the quiet confidence that no one would ever dig deeply enough to discover where the truth had been buried all along. The following Monday, I drove to the county records office carrying a leather portfolio that had belonged to my grandfather. The familiar smell of old paper, floor polish, and aging file cabinets greeted me the moment I walked inside. I had spent enough years working with land records to know exactly where to look, and for nearly 4 hours I compared deeds, plats, tax maps, subdivision filings, and digital parcel overlays. At first glance, everything seemed to support Margaret's story. The most recent subdivision exhibits showed the green corridor extending farther than I remembered. A revised planning exhibit from nearly 12 years earlier used language that seemed vague enough to confuse anyone who had never seen the original surveys. It was not outright proof that the homeowners association owned my land, but it was just convincing enough to make every modern document point in the same direction. I left the building with a growing weight in my chest that no amount of professional confidence could ignore. The next morning I met with an attorney who specialized in property disputes. He listened carefully while flipping through my copies of the county records, occasionally making notes with a silver fountain pen. After almost an hour, he leaned back in his chair and folded his hands. He told me that boundary litigation could take years, expert witnesses would be expensive, and judges often relied heavily on current recorded documents unless overwhelming historical evidence proved otherwise. His recommendation was practical. Negotiate. Accept a settlement. Maybe preserve part of the property instead of risking all of it. His words were calm and professional, but they landed harder than any accusation Margaret had ever made. Driving home, I rolled the windows down and let the cool afternoon air fill the truck, hoping it would clear my thoughts. Instead, I caught sight of fresh stacks of lumber sitting beside the creek. Construction had not stopped for a single day. Workers were already marking locations where benches would soon overlook water that had reflected my family's history for generations. The steady tapping of hammers echoed through the trees while portable generators hummed in the background. Every sound felt like another page turning before I had even begun defending the story. My neighbor, Tom Henderson, walked across the road carrying his mail as I pulled into my driveway. Tom had lived beside us for nearly 20 years, and we had shared countless conversations over fences and fishing trips. He looked genuinely uncomfortable before speaking. "Ethan," he said quietly, "I know this is hard, but maybe they are right. The association has all the maps. Everybody keeps saying the records changed years ago." I nodded politely because I could not blame him. He believed what every official document now appeared to show. That evening I sat alone on the porch listening to the creek flow beneath the fading light. A gentle breeze rustled through the oak branches, carrying the smell of fresh sawdust from the construction site. I stared toward the weathered garage where my grandfather had stored decades of surveying equipment before he passed away. I had not opened most of those cabinets in years. There had never been a reason. As darkness settled across the property, I realized something that unsettled me even more than the letters, the meetings, or the construction itself. Everyone, including experienced attorneys, was relying on the newest records because they assumed newer automatically meant more accurate. My grandfather had spent a lifetime warning me that land never lies, but people sometimes copy mistakes so many times that they eventually begin calling them facts. Sitting there in the quiet, with crickets replacing the distant construction noise, I decided that before I surrendered even a single foot of ground, I owed it to him to search every forgotten shelf, every dusty drawer, and every box he had ever left behind. The garage had always been the quietest place on the property. Long after my grandfather passed away, I never found the heart to organize it. Every shelf remained exactly where he had left it. Rusted tripods leaned against one wall beside faded survey rods. Wooden crates carried handwritten labels and black marker that had slowly faded into soft gray. The air smelled of cedar, machine oil, and old paper that had absorbed decades of humid summers. I switched on the overhead light, and its familiar hum filled the room while tiny dust particles drifted through the beam like slow falling snow. For hours, I opened box after box, finding old transit manuals, engineering journals, tax receipts, and notebooks filled with neat handwriting that only another surveyor could truly appreciate. Every page reminded me how carefully my grandfather documented everything he touched. Near the back corner of the garage stood an old steel filing cabinet that had not been opened in years. The bottom drawer resisted before finally sliding forward with a long metallic scrape. Inside rested a weathered cardboard mailing tube wrapped in cracked brown paper and tied with faded cotton string. My grandfather's handwriting covered the outside in careful block letters. Walker Property, Original Survey. Preserve. I slowly untied the string, feeling my pulse quicken before I had even looked inside. The paper released a dry, familiar scent that every surveyor knows instantly. Aged drafting linen mixed with ink and time. I gently rolled the map across the old workbench and placed small brass weights on each corner to keep it flat. The lines were drawn entirely by hand. Every bearing, every distance, every creek bend had been measured with remarkable precision. The paper itself was nearly 90 years old, yet the craftsmanship looked better than many digital surveys produced today. Folded inside the map lay another surprise. My grandfather's original field book. Every page contained station notes, compass bearings, monument descriptions, witness trees, weather conditions, and measurements written during the original boundary survey. I ran my fingers carefully across the pages until one sentence stopped me cold. Original iron monument established at Northeast Creek Bend. Monument to govern all future retracement surveys regardless of subsequent mapping discrepancies. I read it again, then a third time. Those words were not simply personal notes. They reflected one of the oldest principles in American boundary law: original monuments control. Suddenly, every modern subdivision exhibit I had studied at the county office made sense. They had copied later mapping adjustments, but never physically verified the original monument that still sat only a few feet from my driveway beneath decades of grass and leaves. Someone had redrawn the boundary from office records instead of retracing it from the original evidence on the ground. The mistake had quietly traveled from one document to another until it became accepted as fact. I spread the old map beside the newest subdivision plat I had printed from the county website. At first they looked nearly identical, but the closer I compared them, the clearer the difference became. One missing reference point shifted the entire property line nearly 18 feet toward my house. Every planned walking trail, every decorative bench, every section of the proposed community park depended on that single error. I leaned back against the workbench and listened to the rain beginning to tap softly against the garage roof. Outside, the construction crews probably believed they were building on community land. Margaret certainly believed it. But lying across that old wooden bench was something stronger than confidence, stronger than assumptions, and stronger than every glossy presentation she had ever shown the neighborhood. For nearly 90 years, the truth had been waiting patiently inside a forgotten mailing tube, and now it was finally ready to speak. At sunrise the next morning, I made 3 phone calls. The first was to Daniel Brooks, a licensed surveyor I had trusted for nearly 15 years. The second was to Melissa Carter, a geographic information systems specialist who had spent most of her career comparing historical plats with modern county mapping. The third was to the county survey office requesting a formal monument verification. By noon, the 3 of us were standing beside the creek wearing muddy boots while cool air carried the smell of wet leaves and freshly turned soil across the property. Margaret's construction crews paused just long enough to watch us unload tripods, global positioning system receivers, metal detectors, and survey equipment before returning to work. She arrived a few minutes later in her white sport utility vehicle, stepping out with the same composed smile she always wore during board meetings. She asked whether we were planning to interfere with an approved community improvement project. I simply replied that we were locating original evidence. She smiled politely, but I noticed she had no idea what those 2 words actually meant. Daniel began by setting control points using satellite positioning while Melissa overlaid historical coordinates against the county mapping database. Every measurement pointed us toward the weathered iron monument that still rested beneath years of packed earth near the old creek bend. A small crowd of curious neighbors slowly gathered along the edge of the temporary construction fence. They watched quietly as Daniel knelt beside the rusted marker and carefully brushed away the surrounding dirt with a hand broom instead of a shovel. Surveying has always been about precision, not speed. The metallic scrape of the brush against old iron sounded almost ceremonial. Once the monument was fully exposed, Daniel measured its exact position 3 separate times. Melissa compared each coordinate with the original field notes from my grandfather's survey book. The numbers matched almost perfectly despite nearly 90 years passing between the first measurement and the last. Then came the moment everything changed. Using the verified monument as the controlling boundary, Daniel extended the property line across the entire project area. Bright orange flags appeared one after another as he marked the true line through the grass. Each new flag pushed farther into the area Margaret had labeled community property. The planned walking trail crossed onto my land. The decorative seating area crossed onto my land. Even the large entrance sign already leaning beside the excavator would stand several feet inside my property if installed according to their current plan. Melissa quietly calculated the final offset before looking up from her tablet. 18.4 feet. One overlooked monument had shifted every modern drawing almost 18.5 feet away from the legal boundary. The conversations around us stopped. Even the construction equipment fell silent as operators climbed down to watch. Margaret walked toward Daniel holding a rolled copy of her subdivision survey. She insisted that her engineers had followed the latest recorded map approved by the county. Daniel nodded respectfully before pointing toward the iron monument. He explained that updated mapping could never erase an original controlling monument that still existed exactly where the original survey established it. The rule was older than every subdivision surrounding us. It was one of the first principles every American land surveyor learned. Standing there beside that weathered piece of iron, I suddenly understood why my grandfather had treated it with such respect all those years ago. It was never just a marker buried in the ground. It was a witness that had quietly waded through changing governments, changing neighborhoods, changing maps, and changing opinions. Now, after decades of silence, it had finally spoken louder than every document Margaret had placed in front of the community. 3 days later, the hearing room at the county administrative building felt strangely smaller than I remembered. The soft hum of fluorescent lights mixed with the quiet shuffle of paper as attorneys arranged exhibits across polished wooden tables. Through the tall windows, I could see gray clouds drifting over the courthouse lawn, while a steady rain left thin trails across the glass. Margaret arrived carrying 2 oversized presentation boards mounted with glossy subdivision maps that looked impressive from across the room. She greeted board members, shook hands confidently, and smiled at several residents who had come to watch what they assumed would be a routine confirmation of the Homeowners Association's position. I placed only 3 items on my table: my grandfather's original survey map, his weathered field book, and the certified monument verification completed only days earlier by the county survey office. There were no oversized graphics, no colorful renderings, just documents that had quietly survived almost 90 years. The hearing began with Margaret explaining how updated planning records clearly identified the disputed area as community property intended for future recreational use. She spoke with the same calm confidence that had persuaded so many neighbors during association meetings. Her attorney referred repeatedly to the newest subdivision exhibits, emphasizing that they had remained unchallenged for years. When it was my turn, I did not begin with an argument. I carefully unrolled the original survey map across the table. The old drafting linen made a soft crackling sound that seemed unusually loud inside the silent room. Then I placed my grandfather's field book beside it and slid the certified monument report forward. The hearing officer looked first at the field notes before turning toward the county surveyor seated near the front. He asked only one question: was the original monument located and verified in its original position? The county surveyor answered without hesitation: yes, it remains intact, and it governs the boundary established by the original survey. The room became completely still. Margaret's attorney requested permission to compare the modern subdivision map with the verified monument report. Several long minutes passed as measurements, bearings, and reference calls were checked one after another. The silence felt heavier than any courtroom speech I had ever heard. Finally, the hearing officer removed his glasses, folded his hands, and looked directly at both parties. He explained that modern mapping could assist with property descriptions, but it could not replace a verified original controlling monument that still existed on the ground. Every subsequent drawing based upon the incorrect reference point inherited the same error. The legal boundary had never changed. Only the interpretation of later maps had. Those few sentences ended months of uncertainty. The proposed park expansion could not continue across my property. The association's notices, planned improvements, and boundary claims affecting my land were declared unsupported by the controlling survey evidence. Construction activities within the disputed area would have to stop while corrected records were prepared. Margaret remained perfectly still, staring at the original map spread across the table. For the first time since this began, she did not have another presentation ready, another polished explanation, or another confident smile. As everyone slowly gathered their papers, I carefully rolled my grandfather's survey back into its protective tube. The same faded document that had spent decades forgotten on a shelf had just accomplished what hundreds of pages of modern paperwork could not. It reminded an entire room that the truth does not become less true simply because newer copies repeat the same mistake.